Dr. Matthew Kibbee is the Evidence Synthesis Coordinator at Cornell University Library. He leads the library's Evidence Synthesis Service and Discipline Agnostic Service since 2016. He has contributed to the research of which has contributed to the research of students and faculty across Cornell's Ithaca and Tech campuses. It is situated in Albert R. Mann Library, and he supervises a team of 4 evidence synthesis librarians who also provide general research support in the fields of agriculture, life sciences, human ecology, and applied social sciences. Matthew is a member of the core planning team for the award-winning Evidence Synthesis Institute and is a regular instructor at the World Health Organization, Cochrane, Cornell University, Joan Klein Jacobs Center for Precision Nutrition and Health Summer Institute. Matt Kibbee's talk today, Anna, if you could click that last. Matt Kibbee's talk today is titled Collaborating with Chaos, Steering an Evidence Synthesis Service Through Uncertain Times. And so without further ado, Matt, whenever you're ready to take it away, and if you've got slides to share, we can pass those over to you too.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Okay, so thank you, Cosette. Thank you, Anna. I am, let's say, unreasonably excited to be here today. It's a rare, almost magical feeling when you look over a conferences program and the only thought that goes through your head is, "Ooh, I want to go to that, and I want to go to that, and I want to go to that." And the fact that so much amazing work is available from experts across the library world and it can be highlighted and made available for free is such a gift, and one that I really would have been unimaginable just a few years ago for me. And we had a nice tribute, and I do want to make sure that I personally acknowledge the gift givers here, the volunteer team of conference organizers. They've just done tireless work to make sure this, frankly, complex, complicated event is smooth and engaging and accessible. So as an evidence synthesis librarian, I am just kind of over the moon that LESSS even exists, and the fact that I get to be a part of it. I mean, that's a true honor. I want to just say a quick word about the images in this presentation, and I do have, I believe, the link to the slides for folks if they're interested. So every picture that I have used here shows a work of art that was made by hand. Major museums have increasingly made their collections available to the public with open access high-res images, and I have shamelessly hoarded these pictures over the years like a pretentious magpie. And so I have included information on each image at the end of the presentation just to keep the slides from being too cluttered. And I really hope that these images will just give you something to look at other than my mug while I am yammering on. I've given the talk a rather dramatic title, Collaborating with Chaos, and I realize that plus the subtitles, Uncertain Times, might make you think that this presentation is going to be all dangers and threats and doom and gloom, but I promise it won't be. When I started to think seriously about the symposium's theme of sustainability, I realized the term suggests an antagonist of sort. Something sustains itself in spite of X, whether that be time or lack of resources or dwindling funds. But when you really get down to the simple shape of it, sustainability is order in opposition to disorder, to chaos. But with this presentation, I'm going to try to think about sustainability through chaos, and perhaps suggest a more fruitful way of thinking about sustainability in times when uncertainty is so pervasive. And if that sounds hopelessly highfalutin and abstract for a conference on academic libraries, let's focus on something a little more concrete. Story time. All right. In 2022, Cornell's evidence synthesis team was invited to present on our service to our library leadership team. We were nervous, of course, but we also kind of just assumed that we were there as meeting filler. You know, the agenda's light, so let's let these nerdy librarians talk about whatever evidence synthesis is. So we did our usual rigmarole, evidence pyramid, fishing metaphors, et cetera, et cetera. But then once things wrapped up, the first question caught us completely off guard. They said, "This is amazing. What do you need?" And from that question on, we experienced an unprecedented level of support in terms of staffing, in terms of resources, and in terms of organization. A year later, the evidence synthesis team had doubled in size, new evidence synthesis specific positions were created, and the service received strong administrative support. We were in absolute dreamland. But hold on. Fast forward just 2 more years, and Cornell is beset by legal and financial attacks, including more than $1 billion in frozen funding. The library's budget is severely reduced, and staffing changes have shrunk the evidence synthesis service back down to its original size when we first gave that presentation. In these times, the questions coming to us were not, what do you need, but rather, do you really need Covidence? Do you really need Scopus? Do you really need EndNote? So we had left dreamland and crashed back down to reality. So these two questions, what do you need and do you really need it, are what animate this talk. And I realize, of course, that we all come from very different kinds of institutions, and depending on where you're from, what I have described might not sound particularly generous or particularly burdensome. But I think regardless of scale, these two questions, what do you need and do you really need it, are prompts that we will likely be faced with as providers of these services at one point or another. And so they're worth thinking about together. I'm going to use our experience at Cornell as a bit of a case study in our attempts to grow sustainably during a dramatically uncertain time, about what worked and about what we wished we had done differently. And I'm going to invite you all to think about these questions. What do you need? And do you really need it? And I'm going to suggest that rather than seeing one question as an award and the other as a threat, we can see them as twin engines for change and ultimately, paradoxically, engines for sustainability. So I fear this is a lot of throat clearing before we get to the heart of the matter, but I do think it's important to contextualize my particular case study, because if you're like me, when someone is talking about their particular experience, you're always wondering, okay, how can that translate to my own? So let me just set this scene very quickly. Cornell University is large, and its library system is complicated. Cornell is an R1 university offering more than 100 fields of study with 20 schools and colleges across campuses in Ithaca, New York City, and Qatar. The Ithaca campus, which is where we are, is the largest one. It enrolled 26,000 students plus in 2025, and 10,000 of those were graduate and professional students. Our library system includes 17 unit libraries on the Ithaca campus, employing more than 100 librarians and archivists. So it's a large operation. The evidence synthesis service is located within Albert R. Mann Library, as Cosette said, and we specialize in agriculture, life sciences, and the applied social sciences, but our service is discipline agnostic. We provide assistance to any student, faculty, or staff in the Ithaca or Tech campuses, regardless of field, discipline, or subject matter. Pertinent to this discussion, our medical school, Weill Cornell, is located some 200 miles away from the Ithaca campus in New York City. Weill has its own systematic review service, which serves only its patrons. We collaborate with them occasionally, but we are really just completely separate services. Our service was founded in 2016, and it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, non-medical evidence synthesis services in the country. And let me pause right there and say, I do not have definitive proof of this statement, so it's something that I say all the time in mixed company in almost the hope of being corrected. So if you do know of a service that predates ours in the non-medical field, don't be shy about saying, actually, I will happily take that note. Our team is currently made up of 4 librarians, all of whom have at least 50% of their responsibilities devoted to evidence synthesis support. And although many librarians at Cornell are liaisons, our particular unit library doesn't have the liaison system. So in addition to evidence synthesis support, our team has a percentage of their time devoted to general support in ag, life sciences, and social sciences. Okay, to give you a sense of who I am, let me just give you my quick evidence synthesis origin story. Although our service was founded in 2016, my introduction to this work came a little later when I first finished my PhD and decided to make the transition into libraries. I started working as a reference assistant in this current library, Albert R. Mann, where we are now. And this was, then the pandemic hit. Whole campus was shut down, et cetera. Eventually, the university was exploring how it could potentially reopen safely, and they recruited our evidence synthesis service, which I was not a part of the time, to lead a series of rapid reviews on specific questions that would help inform their model of how to predict the spread of the disease in different scenarios. So this was a massive endeavor, all hands on deck situation. And I was asked as a lowly ref assistant, I felt at the time, to assist in sifting through all the results that the evidence synthesis librarians had retrieved with their searches. So I was introduced to this strange new program called Covidence and set to work clicking yes, no, maybe hundreds of times. And although I was just a small cog in this massive machine, I was immediately captivated by the complexity and major real world impact of this work. It was really only an initial glimpse at what evidence synthesis could do, but it was more than enough to hook me. A few years later, I was lucky to be hired by Cornell as a research and evidence synthesis librarian and eventually made lead of the service. As part of my responsibilities at Cornell, I'm a regular instructor at what we call the Summer Institute for short, because that's the full name and it's a friggin' mouthful. So it's a collaboration between Cochrane, the World Health Organization, and Cornell's nutrition department. It's a really fascinating training program where we bring in clinicians and researchers from around the world. They come to Cornell and are taught how to conduct Cochrane quality systematic reviews with a focus on nutritional sciences and global health policy. I also joined the planning team of the Evidence Synthesis Institute, which is a collaboration between the University of Minnesota, Carnegie Mellon, and Cornell. I'll talk about ESI at length a little further on. And then eventually, more recently, my role was reimagined, and I was given supervisory responsibilities for 4 evidence synthesis librarians, as well as being responsible for leading the day-to-day of the service. Okay, so that's enough about me. Let's talk about you. I'd like you to reflect on this particular question for yourself. Imagine that the holder of the purse strings at your institution came up to you and asked, holding a blank check, what do you need? What would you say? You could potentially ask for anything. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? If you want to throw it in chat, go for it. But if you just want to think of it yourself, that's cool too. I really just want you to kind of go through this exercise for yourself and maybe use it as a point of comparison when you see how we approach this question. And I'll say, if nothing came to you immediately, you are in good company. It was actually surprisingly hard for us to answer this question. On one hand, it feels as though we are always acutely aware of the feeling of not having enough time, not having enough energy, not having enough support, so on. But it's a little harder to know exactly which holes you would want to plug if given the opportunity. Plus, I'd say that splashing the cash isn't exactly a common practice in our world. But in our case, we wished we had thought more about growth when growth seemed the most unlikely. I therefore encourage you to do this exercise with yourself or with your colleagues. Even if you imagine you'll never have anyone ask you, what do you need? I'll just say, we certainly never expected it. First, though, I do have to admit that one of the reasons we had trouble answering this question was because we already had such a solid foundation at our service, and I want to give credit where it's due. The founders of Cornell's service, including Sarah Young, who is here, built an innovative, unique service that has been operating without interruption for 10 years, despite significant turnover, a global pandemic, budgetary peaks and valleys throughout the whole shebang. They built a 2-tiered service that put thoughtful guardrails on librarian workload. They encouraged community through regular team meetings. They produced numerous free and open resources that continue to have an impact today. And they encouraged evidence synthesis librarians to be outward facing, to look beyond the campus for collaborations, and to embrace the truly global impact of evidence synthesis. We had been set up so well that we had to do a little harder thinking to really get to the base of what we lacked. And although we didn't have an immediate answer to this question, our library leadership followed up with us for a request for an executive summary of the service that would also include our wish list. Our first step was to put our very non-business minded heads together and ask if anyone knew what an executive summary was. I don't know if folks here watch The Office, but there's that bit where Jim's new boss asks him for a rundown of his new clients, and Jim spends the entire episode trying to figure out what a rundown is. It was kind of like that, but we got there eventually. In June of 2022, the evidence synthesis team submitted an executive summary to our library's leadership. And when we put this document together, we did so with sustainable growth in the front of our minds. We didn't just want more stuff. I mean, we wanted more stuff, but that's not the only thing we wanted. We wanted to retain what was important to us and expand strategically. We emphasized the service's high demand and potential for improving the quality of evidence synthesis research at Cornell. And what we wanted our key takeaway to be was that this ever-increasing demand required additional resources in order to prevent this innovative service from running aground. So our main ask was staffing, pretty simple. The service had gone from, at its peak, 7 librarians to just 4, and not long after we submitted the summary, further staffing changes reduced us to only 2 librarians with significant portions of our job devoted to evidence synthesis, and 1 liaison librarian with no specified evidence synthesis responsibilities in his job description. He just liked evidence synthesis and did it when he could. So really, additional librarians were a necessity. We asked for 1 librarian to keep the service afloat and another for growth. We emphasized that the resources that we already had that we would need to retain, and we asked for additional software subscriptions like EndNote, Zotero, and an enterprise account for Airtable. I've included a link here to a mildly modified version of this document in case anyone is interested. I removed some names and certain internal statistics just for privacy's sake, but I offer this up not as an example of as a sterling example of how to write one of these things, but maybe to potentially serve as inspiration, as a template, or even a cautionary tale if you're asked about creating something like this for yourself in your own service. So I'll spoil things here slightly and say that we did not get everything that we asked for. In fact, we somehow managed to get both more and less than we asked. And the first change, which we didn't even think to request, was a complete reimagining of the team. In our summary, we noted how the lead of the service didn't have sufficient time devoted to evidence synthesis support and requested an adjustment of their job responsibilities to allow them to focus on evidence synthesis. Instead, library leadership decided to reorganize our distributed service into something closer to a department. So previously, librarians from different unit libraries had formed a kind of loose collective, with each person reporting to a different person within their own unit. But now, evidence synthesis librarians were reorganized into a distinct sub-department, reporting to the lead, me, with the new title of evidence synthesis coordinator. The evidence synthesis librarians were given new titles, research and evidence synthesis librarian, and everyone had at least 50% of their job responsibilities devoted to evidence synthesis support. In this new organization, librarians have to do a lot less struggling to make room for evidence synthesis work. They can juggle more co-authorships at any given time, and by grouping everyone under one umbrella, we're able to have a much better sense of trends, capacity, opportunities. There are some drawbacks, I will say, but I'll discuss those more towards the end. Our biggest bounty, though, was the thing that we needed most, and that is people. If you recall, we asked for one new librarian, two if admin were feeling generous, and I'll be honest, we thought we would be lucky to get one. Instead, at the end of this process, we were able to hire three new evidence synthesis librarians all at once. And we were having a party at this point. How this came about was due to strategy, it was due to clear communication, and it was due in no small amount to luck. So as much as I would like to, I really can't give you a foolproof roadmap for how to convince others to let you hire three evidence synthesis librarians in one go. But I do believe that a number of decisions set the table for this particular banquet, and hopefully those could be useful to you. Initially, we were told we could post for one evidence synthesis librarian. We had tried to do this before, and the previous searches had failed due to a vanishingly small candidate pool. And we kind of thought that maybe it was because we were looking for too much. We were essentially looking to replace an experienced evidence synthesis librarian with an experienced evidence synthesis librarian, which was hard to find at the time. So we decided to go a completely different route. Our focus this time was trying to think outside of the box and being committed to inclusive hiring practices. While Cornell as a whole doesn't require an MLIS in order to be hired as a librarian or archivist, we specifically decided to emphasize flexibility and downplay the importance of a library degree. It's fairly well known, and a recent paper by Lafferty et al. Goes into the matter in excellent detail, that training in evidence synthesis is, for the most part, not a major part of MLIS programs. It may be mentioned in the context of STEM librarianship, medical librarianship, for example, but for the most part, these programs are not preparing their graduates to dive into systematic reviews. And I know I'm like getting really close to opening a can of worms. So let me just talk about the can of worms but leave it closed. The debate over the requirement that librarians have an MLIS for any academic library position is a long-standing debate. And recently, I'd say there's been some recognition that non-MLIS candidates might be preferable when hiring for particular skills or expertise. I promise I'm really not taking a stance on this broader debate, but I will just say that for our decision in this particular case, not being so rigid in our requirements paid off handsomely. So we decided to include only essential qualifications in our job advertisements. Language was added to encourage those without an MLIS who had experience with and/or interest in conducting evidence syntheses to apply. And finally, we used targeted outreach to identify promising candidates who might not be monitoring open library positions. So we did things like reach out to colleagues who had worked with evidence synthesis researchers to see if there were people maybe who would be interested in a career change, or particularly great students who were thinking about librarianship. We contacted prospects with evidence synthesis experience who had expressed interest in library employment in the past. And we looked at local paraprofessionals, reference assistants who had gone to evidence synthesis events or expressed interest in evidence synthesis. We got a lot of reports from candidates that they had really good impressions of our approach. They really liked the targeted outreach. They found the job posting welcoming and approachable, and they really felt as though they were not being penalized for the lack of library experience, but rather being rewarded for unique experience from their own backgrounds. And I'll say the initial candidate pool was a marked increase in quantity and quality of applicants. We attracted 7 times as many applicants as the previous search, with a strong diversity of candidate expertise and backgrounds. And honestly, this was super exciting. The idea of bringing in different expert experiences and knowledge was just really kept us going. We had candidates who had used systematic reviews in clinical practice. We had candidates who were that student that we all know who was being asked to do a systematic review, not getting enough guidance, and doing the entire process by themselves. For some reason, they wanted to devote their life to that feeling and become an evidence synthesis librarian. And we had people like me who had gotten a taste of evidence synthesis as a paraprofessional and wanted more. When we were told we could hire 3 librarians from our candidate pool, it was clear that this decision was due, at least in part, to the exemplary nature of the candidates. And as it turns out, all 3 new hires had advanced degrees other than an MLIS. This was not at all our goal, but it just worked out that way. So training such a diverse group, 3 of them, which we weren't really expecting, had its own challenge. Some of our new hires had experience in libraries, but others had no direct experience working in this profession. So training really had to be personalized for each individual, especially when it came to the non-ES portions of the job. But even the ES experience was diverse, from just like interest and self-study to having done everything from written the research question to doing the systematic or doing the statistical analysis at the end of a meta-analysis, the whole thing. So although the emphasis was on various aspects of the training, differed from person to person, it had a general 5-part structure that we kept the same for everyone. We required the completion of an asynchronous online training. In this case, we used Campbell. It was before the Evidence Synthesis Institute had put out its training for librarians and information professionals. I'd say the Campbell course is great, and actually I think these 2 can be used in conjunction with each other for a really thorough introduction to evidence synthesis. We had shadowing all of the experienced evidence synthesis librarians. We had weekly one-on-one meetings with the lead of the service. We had apprenticeship and reverse shadowing. And then we finally required the completion of the Evidence Synthesis Institute as the kind of graduation, after which they were free to take on their own co-authorships if they wanted. The duration, depth, order, degree of overlap for each of these components was really tailored to meet the need of each new hire's unique learning style and preference. You might be hearing this and thinking, well, that sounds like a lot of work. And yes, it was actually, it was hard in some ways, that because all 3 new librarians started at different times, because they all had different experiences, it did put a little more strain on us, the trainers, because doubling up was rarely possible. I also think it made it slightly trickier to form a cohort because everyone was kind of at different stages of their education, not sure if they needed to go at the same pace, maybe feeling some pressure to catch up, etc. And I, of course, realize that we all have different levels of resources and time we can devote to training others. But I believe this framework kind of offers a scalable and adaptable solution to training librarians to meet this ever-increasing demand. It's a nice mix of things that people can do on their own and also in conjunction with more experienced librarians. And I'm just seeing now, oh man, that's going to bother me. I cut off Whitney Townsend's practice sets. It is included in the references at the end. Sorry about the half citation there. But their University of Michigan Health Libraries practice sets are a great tool to train librarians who are just getting started in this work. I'll say it was also important to me that the new librarians not be singularly focused on providing evidence synthesis support just to Cornell patrons. I really wanted to impress upon them that they were not just becoming expert themselves, but they were joining a community of experts. And that fact carries with it great joys, but also significant responsibilities. And in this, I was really guided by the Evidence Synthesis Institute's emphasis on radical hospitality, which I'll talk about a little more later on. But that was really the inspiration behind this whole kind of creation of community. Locally, I strove to build an environment with regular casual meetings where we all take turns sharing what we're working on and learning on and leaning on our collective expertise to solve the sort of trickier problems that come up in our day to day. Because we don't have liaison areas and our co-authorships are taken on based on individual capacity and interest, this kind of information sharing is absolutely vital. We'll provide our thoughts on patrons that we may have encountered in the past, like, oh, I know that student, they need a little extra help with XYZ. And we can decide collectively what we can take on. You know, we say things like, I'm really swamped right now. If someone could just guide these guys through the initial steps of a protocol development, I can join as a co-author next month. Things like that. They really do. It's really a valuable part of what we do. Also, true contrarian that I am, as soon as the library organized us into a hierarchical structure, I did my darndest to dismantle that structure. At the risk of being accused of pie in the sky idealism, I really do prefer to think of us as a guild of experts, a research gang, a posse of professionals. I don't know, you can call us whatever you want, but I really see that the point of all that training and onboarding that we went to was not to develop productive employees, but to set them up to be equally contributing members of our group. So we all have administrative tasks in support of the service. Our meeting agendas are editable by all, and we collectively decide on policies and strategies for the service. And then finally, I encourage these new librarians to make connections outside of Cornell, whether that means collaborating with other evidence synthesis librarians or participating in communities of practice. What matters is that they're constantly learning and sharing with others what they've learned. Once one learns the basics of evidence synthesis, I'd say it can be kind of easy to fall into a comfortable groove. But the information landscape, especially now, is shifting way too quickly and drastically for that to lead to anything but stasis and stagnation. Indeed, the new hires' engagement with other communities is as important for their professional development as it is for the sustainability of our service. We need to be like a hunting and gathering society, exploring, mixing with different communities, sharing what resources we have, and then bringing back our insights to share with the group. Just going to take a quick sip. We also decided to prioritize Airtable. And we were able to get an enterprise license to Airtable, which was great. And this was really a key factor in us growing sustainably. We wanted to adopt good workflows and project management tools, which would allow for better communication, better consult distribution, and data collection. Airtable, we argued, would allow the team to have a balanced, structured growth and pair that with open communication, which would allow us to handle a higher volume of requests in a more efficient and organized manner. So our decision to ask for an Airtable license was very much made with sustainability in mind. We knew that we had been undercounting our statistics for years, and this was due in part to the clunky system that we have, which has a very long time entry form, is not good for capturing longitudinal data. It's all about kind of discrete transactions. And so there was this kind of sense of like, we will enter our information if we must, but it really doesn't fit in this, it's a square peg in a round hole situation. We also knew that our library leadership was developing a data dashboard that would aid in decision making. And so we knew it was vital for our work to be represented there. With an enterprise Airtable account, the service moved from Trello, which is a free project management platform, to a relational database management system, which allows the service to track and manage reviews across the team and record longitudinal data for these long-term collaborations. Our system was adapted from the University of Michigan, but it's been expanded to take advantage of the enterprise subscription features. So let me plug University of Michigan again. Their base is available for free that you can use and adapt. They have a great recorded workshop on using Airtable for evidence synthesis service management. So I would recommend you check that out if you're kind of curious about Airtable and what it can do. So one of the kind of neat things we can do that we did in order to improve data collection is we made a very simplified time entry form. So when people create a new project, they enter all the information about that project, the requester, when it started, the department, the type of review, all of that is entered in a single initial entry form. Then every subsequent time entry, all a person has to do is select their project, and their entry form is customized so that if since this is my time entry form, only my projects are listed in this dropdown. I select the work type, I select my start date, the date of the thing, and my review time, and that's it. It makes things very, very smooth, and our Airtable base is set up such that it mirrors the database that the university uses to, or the library uses to track its stats, which is LibInsight, part of SpringShare. This allows us to enter our entries in a very simple form and then bulk export those transactions so that they're ultimately included in nationwide metrics. And this doesn't require people to fill out forms or, multiple times or anything like that. I send slightly naggy, slightly lighthearted emails every week to remind the team, and it has improved our data traction immensely. We also have not missed Trello at all because Airtable can do what Trello can do and more. This gives us a kind of layout of all of our reviews. So each little set card here is a specific review, and this says which stage each of the reviews are. And this is important because, as we all know, we're busier based on what stage a review happens to be in. And so we can kind of get a sense of how busy our team is just from seeing this kind of visual layout. Every single thing is clickable. So if you're curious, okay, what is this contagious bovine pleuropneumonia thing? You can look it up. You can see I've removed the requester's name and email, but you can see the affiliation. It'll have the review type. It'll have every single transaction put into this. It will have a total amount of time, which helps us know for consultations, when we need to cut folks off. It's super useful and gives us a really good sense of what's happening across the team. It's also great for reporting out. You can really quickly communicate key facts to others, especially those in library administration. You can give unlimited free viewing permissions to your Airtable base. That might have personal information that you might not want other folks to know. So you can make a kind of a custom interface that can be built to immediately display key facts and visualize significant trends. So this is just a random time period, which shows you, how many active projects we have at one time, what stage these are in. You can see we have a zombie stage too, and the different review types that we're working on. I'll say, though, that sustainable growth is sometimes as much about what you don't ask for as what you do. And the one thing that we really did not ask for was outreach. I had to fight the urge, I'll admit, to shout our growth from the rooftops. There's both an excitement that gives you a sense of invincibility and a feeling of pressure that you need to make sure you do something with all that you're given. And so you kind of want to just tell everyone at once. But if you find yourself in this position, I would urge you to fight those impulses. You, of course, will need to do your own capacity calculations based on your existing usage, expected expansion, et cetera. But for us, we already knew we had more demand than we could handle. And with several large systematic review services in the health sciences having to close or pause due to an overwhelming demand, we knew we really had to be cautious. We turned down any offer to advertise our service campus-wide, and we focused our public workshops on giving people the tools they would need to do this work themselves rather than entice them to use our service. We weren't standoffish, of course, but the idea was more teaching people to fish rather than advertising our new bait shop or something. We did do some targeted outreach to specific groups that we felt had the most urgent need for our assistance and would not overwhelm us if the outreach was successful. But in general, we stuck to word of mouth, and that provided more than enough work for us. So let's review what came out of this question, what do you need? In a short time, we doubled the size of our team. But beyond the raw numbers, we wound up with an energetic, ambitious team with a fantastic range of experience and perspectives. In a short period of time, the usage of our service doubled, the number of active co-authorships tripled, we became attached to some really large and exciting grant projects, we started to expand into departments that had never worked with our services before, even some fields where we couldn't even see if an evidence synthesis project had ever been done before, which is super exciting. And we started to formulate plans for a focused kind of step-by-step expansion into other areas. Our outlook was sunny, the skies were blue, nothing could possibly go wrong. But wait, what's that on the horizon? I don't want to dwell too long on what went wrong because as I said, I don't want this to be a woe is us presentation. But in a short period of time, we had that $1 billion withheld from funds. There was the collapse of the NIH grants, which meant some of our more ambitious projects, like one focusing on the health effects of climate change. You can imagine that was first up to the chopping block. That stuff came to a hard stop. The university instituted campus-wide austerity measures, including significant budget cuts for the library. And at the same time, we had some staffing changes, which meant that two of our team had to leave Cornell, and the financial situation has not allowed us to rehire yet. So, less than 2 years after being asked with a kind of open wallet, what do you need? The questions became, do you really need it? Do you really need Covidence? Do you really need Scopus? Why would you need two citation managers, Zotero and EndNote, et cetera, et cetera? I will say, though, I will say that this question inevitably raises some anxiety and some tension. But actually, what I want to encourage you to do is to think about this question in the same spirit you think about the question, what do you need? It shouldn't be avoided because it's uncomfortable to think about. It's really, really easy to latch onto what you have and become so focused on keeping a grip on it and maintaining status quo rather than working with uncertainty and using this prompt for the same type of imaginative thinking you do during times of abundance. So as I talk about these leaner times, I'm really not interested in enumerating the bare minimum number of people or databases or budget necessary to maintain operations for a two-tiered evidence synthesis service or whatever. Those material conditions are, of course, incredibly important. But I think when you get to those extremes, your local conditions will dictate the answer to those questions more than any kind of magical formula I could come up with that would apply to every single context. Most importantly, however, I want to focus on how one can approach these conditions, not with wailing and gnashing of teeth, but with energy, curiosity, and creativity. That said, I do feel like I need to mention one specific concrete necessity that we kind of dug in our heels for, and that is screening software. We really did receive a request that we justify our need for Covidence, and we knew right off the bat that losing access to some sort of screening platform would not just be damaging to the service, but highly detrimental to evidence synthesis research at Cornell. So we dug in our heels here. We did look at alternatives, and we spent a long time looking at SysRev, which is a neat, a really great platform. It was more cost effective than Covidence. It has Gen AI integration to speed up screening and extraction, and it's quite adaptable for different review types. We decided to stay with Covidence for local reasons. We were able to negotiate a little down, and we do have so many people using Covidence right now. We were concerned that with our smaller team, it might be tricky to manage the transition. But if folks are being asked, do you really need Covidence, Rayanne, Distiller, things like that, I'd recommend giving SysRev a look as a potential alternative. So thinking about library leadership, one might tend to think that if there are no resources being doled out, getting your library leadership engaged with what you're doing maybe shouldn't be a priority. But I'm going to suggest the opposite. Now is the time when you want their backing, and not just by and I'll say by just being an evidence synthesis librarian, you are in an excellent position to show your value to the library and institution. Taking an active approach to securing administrative backing, even if it doesn't immediately translate to improved resources, will help you sustain your service and position you well for further growth if and when resources do become available. So when you're strategizing about this, I'd encourage you to reconsider how you talk about the work that you do. We like to think we all have shared values, but what we find fascinating or important about evidence synthesis might not be what appeals to others. Within our insider circles, the value, demand, and impact of evidence synthesis is well known or are well known, but we use a million little verbal shortcuts to talk to each other about this work. And when you're communicating your value to others, do your best to interrogate assumptions. Cast your mind back to when you were first learning about evidence synthesis. It can be helpful, especially if you know your institution isn't yet in a position to dole out resources, if you frame your discussion less as we need stuff and more as we can help you communicate the impact of librarians. In my experience, effectively communicating the value of evidence synthesis to those not actively working in this area is an extremely important and underrated skill. It can help you speak to alumni and donors and to administrators whose backgrounds might not allow them to intuitively grasp what we do. I've heard, and you probably have heard too, people in positions of power talk about evidence synthesis and even say it's important, but without obviously having a good understanding of it. And that's really not what you want. Even if your library dean is never going to be able to quote the Cochrane Handbook chapter and verse, you do want them to at least be able to tell others in a general sense why this work is important, and you will often need to help get them there. So meet them where they are. Oops, I went a little ahead. I'm cribbing from the Zen Buddhist phrase, beginner's mind here, which refers specifically to an approach to meditation where one kind of sloughs off any assumptions, habits, or rules that one has accumulated in order to approach the present with an innocent perspective, free of so-called expertise. That's what this beginner's mind comes from. Just a quick disclaimer. I am citing that book, so you don't think I'm trying to claim the phrase as my own, but do not assume that that book will give you any kind of practical tips on promoting specialized research services and librarians and libraries. It is a lovely book, but it won't be of much help there. Really, in our context, what I'm suggesting is that you try to recall what it was like before you knew about evidence synthesis. Maybe you heard it from a colleague, maybe a faculty member approached you to ask for help with a systematic review, and while you were nodding politely and modeling active listening, you were screaming in your head, "Oh my God, what is this? I don't know what it is." Try and bring back that moment every now and then. It's a good thing to keep in mind the diverse audiences with whom library leadership might interact. Folks who might not have a great idea about what academic librarians do, let alone what STEM librarians do, or social science librarians, evidence synthesis librarians. You get the idea. Even an administrator who is science literate and can speak about evidence synthesis with some facility might not have the best rhetorical tools to talk about it with non-experts. They might not have the time or the ability to puzzle out how best to speak to them. And this is where you can help. So metaphors are obviously the place to go. And this is metaphors in science are a really fascinating topic. And I'll admit, part of my doctoral work was on this subject. So it's entirely possible you do not find it as fascinating as I do. So I won't talk about it too much. But they can be really helpful in communicating complex ideas to relative novices. But I would encourage you to do a little light literary analysis on your way of explaining things to see what's being emphasized and what's being diminished. Let me give you a concrete example. At Cornell, the standard metaphor we trot out when introducing evidence synthesis to non-experts is that of fishing. A normal lit review is like a person going down to the old fishing hole, casting out a few times, keeping the fish they find, maybe tossing back one or two if they're not edible, and then calling it a day. But an evidence synthesis project, on the other hand, well, we're like industrial fishing trawlers that precisely track and map fish movements. We spread out massive nets to capture everything within a given area and then sort through the gigantic haul in order to capture the targeted type of fish while discarding all the unnecessary types of fish. That's the metaphor. I honestly never really liked identifying myself with an industrial fishing trawler, talk about sustainability. But it seemed to be a readily graspable way to introduce evidence synthesis to beginners. But think about what's being emphasized in this metaphor. It's not about the impact of the work. It's not about the collaboration between different types of experts. It's not about the reduction of bias. What's being emphasized is the searching. Its emphasis is on scale, it's on complexity and power of the information retrieval process. It focuses on what we do and makes it sound really impressive. And in that sense, it's not wrong, but it's a metaphor by librarians for librarians. I realized that when I'd use the metaphor in presentations or talks, I'd succeed in communicating to folks what evidence, and I'd succeed in communicating that we worked really hard, but that's honestly not going to get you very far. Instead, when you're working with leadership, we want the emphasis to be elsewhere, and that's impact. Fortunately, we as evidence synthesis librarians are in a great position here. We do work that has real world impact, and there is a clear through line from what we do to impacts in the real world. And in my conversations with library leadership, this can be a real boon. They struggle with stereotypes about what librarians do. They hear all the time librarians are for storing books and providing study space and little else. Maybe there's some shushing in there, but other than that, we don't really know what librarians do. But with evidence synthesis work, you can really have very concrete and exciting examples that counteract those kinds of stereotypes. Vital decisions are made on the backs of this research. And if you've been doing this for any length of time, you likely have specific projects you contributed to that have affected policy or medical decisions or other real world actions. And even if you don't yet, you can communicate this work's importance and potential by using specific examples from colleagues or from the media. What I'm really saying is that the story is right there. We are writing these great stories, and you just need to tell it in a way that people see it. And evidence synthesis, of course, ticks a lot of other boxes that administrators are looking for. They're often highly cited. They bring in, attention to the institution. We have these long, intense collaborations, so we develop really great relationships with faculty and students. And then, and I don't have any data for this, but I have something I've been noticing recently. Evidence synthesis projects appear quite often in news media, due in part to their kind of authoritative answer to one or more important questions. And this visibility can be real appealing to folks who are trying to help other folks understand the importance of librarian co-authorship and why we need to have time to devote to these long-term projects. So, to leave the leadership thing, although this is they're certainly part of our community. I think to some people, community seems like a bonus or an optional perk or something you do to kind of check the professional development box of your CV. And in the systems where we work, that elevate and praise individuals, the unspoken directive that we often receive is get your own house in order, and then you can start worrying about what others are doing. But I find this mentality to be completely backwards. In fact, if pressed on the question, do you really need, I would die on the hill that community is what we need most of all. Our professional communities give us inspiration. They challenge us to shake off complacency. They provide sympathy when we're struggling, and they cheer us on when we're killing it. I can't speak with authority on other kinds of librarianship, but I really do believe there is something unique to this work that insists upon community engagement. I don't know if it's just like sheer volume of information to learn, the long hours we spend alone writing and testing searches, or the challenges we face in describing what we do to others. Whatever it is, I don't think this work can be done well, at least not for very long, in isolation. So I'm going to conclude this with just saying a few words about community, because I hope that if you're ever asked, do you really need to be spending your time hobnobbing with these evidence synthesis people, you'll cross your arms and answer with a resounding yes. So I've mentioned the Evidence Synthesis Institute's come up a couple times already. I'm assuming most folks here know that it is a free training for evidence synthesis librarians outside of the health sciences, or any librarian who's providing evidence synthesis support. So here are a few basic facts. Again, I'm kind of assuming a general knowledge of this institution. But outside of the knowledge I've gained as both a student and instructor at ESI, which is extensive, it's been their approach to community building that I have found most revelatory. For those who haven't attended ESI, and I admit that I'm biased because I admit I'm biased, but this is not a backdoor brag. This is really the atmosphere that Megan and Amy and Sarah and other folks have created, and it's really something special. It's a place where people of varying levels of expertise can share and learn from each other, where even the most experienced folks communicate with a spirit of generosity and humility, and people feel comfortable engaging with what can be an intimidating topic. Megan Coker, the co-PI on the original grant, calls this radical hospitality, and while the approach seems subtle and maybe modest, the effects earn its radical descriptor. ESI is not content to just dump information on its learners and show them the door. Rather, it's built on the recognition that learning happens within specific material and social contexts, and that creating those environments can be as important as any learning objective or lesson plan. What's more, there's an understanding that these community contexts can stretch and sustain themselves well beyond a 4-day workshop. And we've tried to support that with symposia, with a conference, and with a treasure trove of free and open resources. And the great thing is, if you haven't done ESI or you're missing the community of ESI, it is totally possible to make your own. In fact, that's exactly what we did in our little corner of upstate New York. Ithaca has 2 major schools, Ithaca College and Cornell, and the librarians from both groups decided to come together to, in part, recreate the atmosphere of ESI. We have an established evidence synthesis service, while Ithaca only has 1 librarian providing evidence synthesis support. But these differences were the draw for all of us. The diversity of perspectives is what made our little community gatherings so interesting. Over time, we've added other folks, including people working outside of libraries or doing evidence synthesis work in the private sector, and these experiences only add richness to our conversation. Like ESI, we've made a listserv, we have Zotero libraries, we focus on in-person meetings with gatherings held at Cornell and Ithaca College and Binghamton University. I saw Laura was here. She was generous enough to host us there. And our meetings are really designed with inclusivity as the guiding principle. Our hope is to attract more people to evidence synthesis, even if they find the topic sort of confusing or intimidating. So we have things like how to teach the not. This is something where I tried 3 different ways of teaching people how to use the not technique and asked which way was the most effective, or rather the least confusing. We have people talking about research waste, which isn't specific to evidence synthesis, but which is a big part of what evidence synthesis can combat. And we had folks who were working outside of libraries talk about how you can do evidence synthesis in the private sector, which was super interesting to everyone. I mentioned earlier that engaging with a community carries with it both joys and responsibilities. And as librarians, we're great at listing off resources for people, but I think it would be a mistake to think about community resources solely as things you can acquire and use. ESI, the folks who founded Cornell Service, and many other groups have maintained a principle of creating and distributing resources for others to use freely. And this is how we sustain ourselves as experts and practitioners, not by being proprietary or possessive, but by creating and sharing so that others can use, adapt, and share their creations. So what does it mean to collaborate with chaos? And sorry, I know I'm running a little low on time here, so I'm skipping over. I've skipped over kind of what we are doing now in our service. If you want to ask about that, happy to talk about it in questions, but I want to allow a little room for discussion. What does it mean to collaborate with chaos? I like this sculpture as a representation of this rather paradoxical idea. A dancer who's seemingly moving with ease and flow, distinctly part of the stone, even while the freedom of her movement seems to defy the material's heaviness. It's graceful because of the contrast of movement and stasis, not in spite of it. So similarly, your structure should give you freedom, not hold you back. In my mind, one important aspect of collaborating with chaos is never being too attached to any one model or structure. When I first took took lead of our service, I took on everything because I was so afraid of letting the service have to pause or put on a wait list or anything like that. It was very much, this is not happening on my watch. While that might be noble, it is not a path to success, and it's frankly just ego-driven. I think the real challenge is to rethink things if material conditions are not allowing them to continue. Having chaos as your collaborator also means never settling in your current reality. Is money pouring in? Perfect time to think about scarcity. Is a moth flying out of your wallet? Let's think about founding an institute or putting on a conference. This will help you plan for eventualities, of course, but I use the word fantasize intentionally here because I want to stress the playfulness of this type of thinking. Uncertainty can spark fear if you let it, but it can also be the driver of curiosity and creativity and lead to exciting new things. And finally, as stressful as things might get locally, keep your hand in at least a few external communities. I can't tell you how many times I felt strung out and discouraged because of something happening at work, but then I'll interact with the ESI folks or our local community of practice and come away energized and excited to do my work. Community gives you perspective and support, but it also gives you an outlet for your creativity. You are surrounded by people who are interested in what you're doing. This symposium is an excellent example of this, and I hope that you'll bring that spirit of mutual collaboration to these events over the next few days, and I hope you're as excited to do so as I am. I want to thank you all for your attention, for allowing me to contribute in my small way to this great community. It is a true honor. I think we might have a few minutes for questions. Thank you so much.